and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it's supported by the Nebraska Environmental Trust. Let's see if the mouse wants to work here. Okay, so the way that this project is set up, it's modeled after the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas, and we basically split the state up into a whole bunch of different grid cells. And the grid cells are split up by high interest areas. And these are the dark green cells that you see on the slides. And these can be areas that have a lot of historical records of bumblebees where we'd like to do some population comparisons. It could be areas that are Nebraska's biologically unique landscapes, or it can be an area that has absolutely no observations of bumblebees that we're just interested in finding more about that state. So after we split up the state into grid cells, that's when we engage the community, teach them how to go out and do surveys, ask them to report back what they find. And then this basically builds up a huge baseline data set for us to gain a better understanding of the bees in Nebraska. And so this is a map from about May or June this year. And as people sign up to volunteer for the project, they adopt a grid cell. So they select an area in the state and say, hey, I'm going to go monitor in this area. So that it allows us to spread out. And so the dark gray areas on here are areas where more than 5 volunteers are surveying. And so once that happens, we sort of shut the cell off to encourage people to go out to other places in the state. And after they have adopted a grid cell, there's a training process. And thanks to COVID, a lot of us had to go to an online platform this year. So we tried to make some informative videos on how to swing nets and how to handle bees. And then the volunteers go out and conduct surveys. And so these surveys are all catch and release. So you freeze a bumblebee. It allows you to take high quality photographs that myself or other experts can then identify. And then all the data that comes in, here we have a time lapse of the observations that were collected just this year. There was almost 2,000 records that came in, and you can see a pretty nice distribution. So this is between June, July, August, and September. And most of these bumblebee observations were attached to a habitat survey as well. And so what we plan to do with all of these observations that have come in is look at different species, look at the phenologies, look at their distribution. One in particular that we're excited to look at is the Southern Plains bumblebee. And all the pink dots on here are observations just this year that have come in. So we had almost 60 observations of this bee. And this is a tier 1 at-risk species listed in Nebraska. And you can see that we've got a pretty nice distribution across the state. And when we look at a map of this, the orange is area where the bee, it resides, but the red hashed area are areas where it's showing decline. So it's nice to see this bee pretty well spread throughout Nebraska still. And even though it was only about 3% of our observations, I think this is going to allow us to glean some really nice insights on this species and what kinds of plants it's using, what types of habitats we're finding this bee in most often to really refine those conservation actions to protect these species. Some other things that we can look at are range distributions in general. So here we have a lemon cuckoo bumblebee, and while we only had a few observations of this bee come in, when we look at it on a bigger picture view, we can see that it resides on the very edge of its range still, which is just exciting information for us to see, because we know that when organisms are in decline, where we see most of that decline is on the edges of their range, right? They're doing pretty well at the center, but when you get to those edges is where you start to see the range decreasing. And so knowing that these bees are still existing on the edge of their range is really good, insightful information. And in addition to collecting bumblebee records, we also ask volunteers to run a quick habitat assessment, just so that we can get a snapshot of the area that they're surveying. So again, we haven't dove into any of this information yet, but the software that we use for people to submit their data sort of generates these preliminary graphs for us so we can see what kind of data they're submitting. So one of the things that they submit is an abundance measure. And so on the map here, all these little different colored dots just shows that there's a diversity of surveys that were done that have a difference in abundance. So all of the blooming resources that were on the landscape, it could have been more than 90% of the survey area was in bloom, or maybe 0 to 10 was in bloom. We also asked volunteers to give a diversity measure. So how many different types of plants did you see in bloom? And then we asked them to name them. And this gives us a list of the plants that were available, the plants that were being used by the bees, just so that we can draw a little bit more information. We also asked people to look at nesting resources. So we asked if there were bunch grasses in the areas, or brush piles, bare soil, things that we know are associated with bumblebee nests. We want to know how much of those are in the area that they were surveying. In addition, we asked about management practices, the overall habitat type that they were in, and the surrounding habitat type. So were you near a riparian area? Were you near agriculture? Were you near or in pasture land? Just so that we can paint a better picture of the survey areas that were being done across Nebraska. And at one point in the season, I think this was about early August, we thought that most of the grid cells that were going to be adopted had been. Like, we didn't think we were going to be attracting too many more individuals that were new to the project by this point in the season. So we sort of shifted our priority to getting more surveys done. So what we did is we highlighted all the areas in Nebraska that still needed surveys, because one of the overarching goals of the project was to get at least 2 surveys done per grid cell. And this was just going to give us a nice baseline data set to work with, so that we didn't have, information only from the Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha area, right? We wanted it all across the state. And so we thought we would highlight all of the cells here that needed surveys. So the dark blue areas are grid cells that had absolutely no surveys. And the light blue areas are cells that only had 1 survey. So to feel like this project was complete, we wanted to get as many surveys done in these blue cells that we could. And so we put out a call to all of our volunteers to be like, hey, if you would like to, we would really appreciate it if you could step up and run a couple more surveys in these particular grid cells. And the response to that was absolutely amazing. So just in 1 month here, these are like 10-day time lapses of people going out and running additional surveys. Many of these volunteers had driven from eastern Nebraska all the way out to western Nebraska to help us knock off some of these cells. In that one time span right here, 68 different habitat surveys came in, which was really, really nice and really just inspiring to see so many people from this community that we've created in such a short time step up and help us really finish the project here. And so we only ended up with 1 grid cell that didn't have any habitat surveys done in it, which is pretty nice for us as we go forward and try and analyze everything that's been collected. And so here's the complete picture of all the data that the Atlas has collected so far. Between 2019, we had a short season. It was only the last little bit of August and September where volunteers could survey. And then 2020, people were surveying between June and September. And so in that time period, almost 2,500 records of bumblebees were submitted, and nearly 260 habitat surveys were submitted. And without all the community scientists that really stepped up to help us finish out this project, at least the community science portion of this project, we really would not have been able to gain such a large baseline data set across the state. And so some of the things that we plan to do with this data are look at population shifts. Nebraska has a really nice historical data set going back to the late 1800s. There's another large data set from Doug Golick, who's a part of this project as well at UNL from the early 2000s. And so being able to compare this current data set with the 2000s, with the 1800s, is just going to be able to allow us to look at bumblebee trends throughout many, many years. We can also look at the species distribution within Nebraska. We can look at phenology. So when are some of these species more active? What times of the year are they peaking? We can look at any correlations with particular ecoregions or species as far as nesting resources go, management practices, habitat types. And then we also plan to update a bumblebee guide for Nebraska that Doug had put out some years ago. And so the third part of the grant that we have from NET is to meet with land managers and meet with Nebraska Game and Parks and really refine our conservation measures and see how this data can help us better conserve bumblebees in the state. And just to back out from Nebraska a little bit, all of the Bumblebee observations go into this database that's a community science project in the United States and Canada called Bumble Bee Watch. And so all the users that participate in the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas are essentially participating in Bumble Bee Watch. And this project launched in 2014. And 30,000 different people have submitted bumblebee observations. And you can see there's a nice spread throughout the United States. It's a little bit of a hole in the Great Plains, but we have hope that it'll spread. But I think the really important thing here that I want to highlight is there's a large database called Bumblebees of North America, right? It's basically the mothership of where bumblebee records are stored. And it goes back to the 1800s. It's got museum specimens, it's got research specimens. Pretty much any known bumblebee record is in this database. And in the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, the observations from Bumblebee Watch have made up 25% of that huge database. And so I think it's just really important to realize the powerful impact that community science can have on the larger research community. And going into that a little further, it's just something that we have to realize that people are out there that want to help. You know, there was a paper that came out earlier this year looking at Canadian residents and their awareness about bee conservation. And the graph that I pulled out of that paper here was asking people to state any barriers that they felt existed existed in getting in the way of helping to conserve bees. And two of the larger portions here were that people don't know how to help or they lack the resources. And so projects like the Bumblebee Atlas or some of the mini Monarch Watch programs, they create space for people to be curious and for people to learn and to share and just really increase science literacy across the conservation field. And I think having these projects is so important, you know, because people want to get involved. And so when we can just give them a little bit of guidance, they can really run off and give us some very pivotal contributions to science. And looking at just the Atlas programs, there's one in the Pacific Northwest, Nebraska, obviously, and then we started one in Missouri this August. Just this year, between June and September, these three projects have more than 680 community scientists. They've contributed 10,000 bumblebee observations of 20 different species and nearly 1,000 habitat surveys. Like, that information would not be able to be collected by a single scientist or even a group of scientists. And the great thing about these projects is that they were designed similarly, right? They're in different regions, but the way that data is collected, they can all be compared. And so it's important to put that design into these projects at the forefront, but also give people enough value that they want to keep contributing to something like this. And so I just want to end here by saying thank you to everybody that has participated in the Atlas. You know, it really does take a village to find success in a project like this. So the many community members, but also agencies like Game and Parks. There were many, many nonprofits, Crane Trust, Prairie Plains, Nebraska Audubon, Nature Conservancy, Pheasants Forever. There's also Nebraska Department of Transportation. So many people helped us make this project successful, and we are really hoping to get another sampling year in 2020. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and I will take any questions.
Great job, Katie. We do